Colleagues, students, friends, welcome to this evening's lectures. My name's Merlin Crossley. I'm the DVC academic here, and it's a great pleasure and honour to be opening this, which I think is the fifth in the series of Scientia Education Academy lectures, which our PVC Education, Jeff Smith's initiated and has been leading. These events are hugely important. It's an opportunity for us to celebrate some of the absolutely world-class teachers, educators we have within our community. It's an opportunity to learn from them, and it's an opportunity in question time to test them and make them even better. And I think that's very important too. And for me, it's been eye-opening because university teaching, I often hear anecdotal comments about this, but I don't know. I don't see all the different lecturers in action. What I do is ask the students. But through this series, I'm getting to see some of our absolutely innovative staff here and what they're doing. And it's an eye-opener for me, and I'm sure it is for everyone. So today we have another leader in education from the Faculty of Medicine. I should say, I look at the student feedback scores. Medicine leads the university. It's a terrific community of students who are very engaged, obviously enjoy what we teach them and also work as a community. And today we have Dr. Chinthaka Balasooriya. I once had a friend who had an MBBS and a PhD. We used to call him Doctor, so I could call Chinthaka Doctor, although I know his academic rank's higher than that. He's an inspirational teacher. I'm very glad to see, welcome to some of his students here tonight. It's terrific when the students come along. He is here because of his excellence. He's well known as a great teacher. He's received the Faculty of Medicine's Teaching Excellence Award, the Vice Chancellor's Award, and he's even been recognised at a national level by the Australian Learning and Teaching Council citation. More than this, he's an editor of journals and a contributor to journals on educational research, and he's held and holds Category 1 grants on educational research and the practice and scholarship of teaching. He works on the international stage, partnerships with some of the leading universities in the world, such as the Shanghai Jiao Tong University. And most of all, he's known for his collegiality and collaborative approach to teaching. And I think universities work best where you have excellent people who are competing with themselves to be even better and competing with themselves but collaborating with other people. And it's terrific to have people like Chinthaka. And I must just again emphasize how great the medical faculty is. I mean, if you're a doctor, you can treat someone and cure them for a day, but if you're a medical educator, you can teach someone to be a doctor who can cure the whole world. And that's what medical educators do. So welcome to the stage. I'm looking for your talk very much. Thank you, Chinthaka.
Thank you, Merlin, for those kind words. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. Time is precious, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for sparing this time for this event. It is going to be an interactive event, so over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through a small journey, and I hope that I get to hear your points of view and understand how we can go on this journey together. Let me start with a story. And before I launch into my story, I'm going to ask you to think back to your childhood, possibly even closer than that. Think about a cartoon. Think about Tom and Jerry or the Roadrunner. And the classic image of the roadrunner going at top speed and colliding with a brick wall, and then literally flattening himself and sliding down. This, of course, happens only in cartoons. 2 years ago, I walked into a glass door. As some of you might know, this can be quite a shocking experience. The shock hits you before the pain hits you, and then the pain lingers. Now, I'm someone who believes very deeply in reflection. You may get the irony of that. And I teach reflection, and I reflect on my own mistakes. So as I reflected on this experience, I wondered, what can I take away from this? And as I reflected, I realized that the incident actually had slowed me down. I was treading with utmost care, and I was seeing glass doors where there were none. Over time, I overcame this, and I was striding happily along until, you guessed it, last month, once again. Now, what does this mean? So I reflected once again. What could I have done? Should my reflection have stopped me from colliding with the second door? Was that the message? But I actually realized that the message was something much deeper. In between the two collisions, I had a clear run of 2 years in which I achieved much and at great speed. I wouldn't have done that if I had been watching out for glass doors. And the message here is this: we live in a world which is evolving and changing, and we've got to keep up with the times. So my first message today is, don't fear the unseen glass door. With that, let me take you into, or give you a quick glimpse of what I'm going to talk about today. I'll take you through the structure of today's talk. So I'm going to start by looking at the global view. What is happening around us? What are the examples that we can look at and learn from around the world? I'm going to then take a very quick look at the UNSW experience. How are we responding? And are we keeping up with the rest of the world? I'm going to then go into my own personal journey, give you a bit of insight into how I came to be here, talk about some examples from UNSW Medicine, and then finally bring it all together. In between, we will take a small interlude where we will have some discussion and some questions. And of course, at the end, there'll be time for more questions as well. Right, so let's look at the global view. As we look at the global picture, what we realize is that almost every single university of repute is innovating. There's so much innovation going on, and there's so much change going on. It's mind-boggling to look at all of the literature around the innovations that are happening in this world. What is driving this change? We have an idea of change that's coming. And if I was to put it in one phrase, it would be the certainty of uncertainty. We know that the future is going to be different, but we don't quite know in what way it will be different. We have a glimpse into what we may need, and we are all very keen to be prepared. So universities are changing, we are changing, and we know a few things that are going to be critically important. So as we look at the literature, we find that the major innovations that are happening tend to focus around a few key themes. And here I'm going to draw on a report from the Higher Education Academy in the UK, which helped me to look at a range of examples from which I was able to distill 5 key themes. And as you can see here, student support tends to be the number one, I will call it an innovation, and we can discuss that as we go further into detail. Student support tends to be one of the areas that is receiving the most attention. Secondly, learning spaces. And as you can imagine, learning spaces is a term where the meaning is changing. And you can understand that space no longer means a physical space. It can also mean a virtual space. And therefore, the idea of learning spaces is evolving. Partnerships. There is a lot being done around partnerships. International partnerships, interinstitutional partnerships, collaboration between academics, but most importantly, collaboration between students and teachers. So there's a lot around partnerships that's happening around the world. Support for university teaching. Now, some of you might think this is obvious, but many of us know that this has not explicitly been so. With thanks to all of those of you who've come from beyond UNSW, to give you a brief insight into that, while research and teaching tend to go hand in hand at university, research has tended to dominate for some time. And while attention is probably unnecessary and unfortunate, that has tended to be so. But we are shifting back towards an emphasis on teaching. Let's look in detail. Sorry, I think I skipped over one, which was the focus on new competencies. And this is a critical point. What are these new competencies of the future? What are the skills that our graduates can have that a robot, for example, cannot replace? What are the skills of the future that we need as humans, as the next generation of humans who take leadership of the world? What are those skills, and in what way can higher education adapt? So let's look at each of these in some detail. As you would understand, student support by itself is not a new concept. And as we look through, none of these items by themselves is new. But taken together, they are. And the novelty here is in the emphasis, that we are now recognizing the importance of student support. The need to support students in this physical space that we call a university. That the role of the New World universities relies very heavily on the nature of the support that we provide to our students. This is something I'd like to open up for discussion as we take the next break. But there's an emphasis here on the first year experience, on students coming into universities, but there's an emphasis here also on international students. And we know internationalization is happening, and it happens very well at UNSW. And integrating and incorporating and allowing our international student cohort to better integrate into the local community is an integral part of what we do. So initiatives that encourage that are critically important as we build our way forward. Learning spaces. This is something that captures almost everybody's attention. We know that the world is changing, and we know that what the next generation calls a space is not necessarily what we call a space. We know the meaning of virtual spaces is becoming more and more relevant, but we are not quite sure in what way it changes what we do. We know that it's capable of changing interactions. We know it's capable of facilitating interactions. And we know that in some cases, it can replace interaction. But what does that do? Where does that leave us? And is there a gap? What is the role of a physical space within that new world where the virtual could dominate. I put it to you that the role of the physical space could potentially become even more significant as the virtual world becomes more and more prominent in the world of a learner, because that is the element that will be missing. And so paying adequate attention to the physical environment and ensuring that that void is not left as a void is critical as we think of the university of the future, which is sort of captured in that last point, which talks about redesigning spaces and environments to support learning. And it's capturing both the physical and the virtual. And we may have a world where the two actually intertwine. Partnerships, and this is critical. We know about collaboration. We know about the value of working together. And we know that this is happening. But what can we do to make it work better? We know that often it's easier to work by yourself. It's sometimes more efficient to just get it done. We know that working in a group brings a whole lot of challenges. And we know that not always is another perspective welcome. But that doesn't mean it does not add value. The other does add value. Collaboration brings with it great value, even though we might find our progress slowed by it. Understanding the perspectives of others really helps us to go forward. And it becomes critically important as we talk about the student-teacher partnership, where we have started to understand the value that students themselves bring in telling us what is likely to work for them. Finally, support for university teachers. As I mentioned, this would seem obvious, but is something that is only quite recently starting to happen. But it is happening, and it is heartening to see that it is happening. And it is a move that we watch with great interest. The focus on competencies for the future. This is something we can speculate on, make an educated guess on. We can never know for sure. But we do know that creativity, critical thinking, decision making, these attributes are likely to be critically important in the graduate of the future. We know that collaboration, communication, reflection, the ability to adapt and be flexible are skills that are highly valued by employers, sometimes even more than the content knowledge that our graduates take with them. So the focus on professional skills and the focus on what our graduates needs to look like is a changing picture that we need to be quite conscious of. So, does UNSW respond to this change? How do we fit in the global picture? And before I go to that, let's look at what universities need to do and what skills we need to build and how we can contribute towards building those. The UNSW approach. Some of you will be familiar with what's known as the Scientia education experience. This is something that's being built, being developed, being designed by those in the room. So Merlin and Jeff have been doing some fantastic work, and so has Marina, leading this initiative along. The Scientia education experience, and we've got 4 pillars upon which we believe the Scientia experience can be built. If we look at the 4 pillars, and I'll give you a moment to have a look at the 4 pillars, What I found fascinating was to compare our 4 pillars with the themes that are emerging from the global literature. The focus on student support and learning communities was one of the central themes that emerged from the global literature. And it's one of our key items, our key pillars. We believe in building a learning community. And the importance of this was brought home to me as I started speaking to people as I thought about today's event. Probably the biggest part of my preparation for today was to speak to people. I spoke to a wide range of people, the most important being future and current students. And the message that I got very clearly from them was that the learning community, the learning culture, the culture of the university, they used various words to describe it. But what they were describing was the environment, the culture, the community into which they were entering. Some had visions about what they want that culture to be like. Others had concerns that they would be leaving their school culture and coming into a place which did not have a culture. There were varied views on what culture and learning community meant, but the value that students placed on community was quite fascinating. There are students in the room, and I might ask them to speak to that as we take a break in the next few minutes. We'll take a look at being digital. What does that mean? This is something that is both exciting and anxiety-provoking. Being digital does not mean taking everything and turning it into an online activity. Being digital means being judicious in choosing what works best. Being digital means knowing when technology adds value and knowing how to blend the two so that you get maximum value for all the resources at your disposal. Let's move to inspired learning. This is a very succinct way of expressing something very deep. Inspired learning is what we want our students to do. We try various things to facilitate that. And part of it is being inspiring ourselves as teachers. But that's not the only part. Inspiration in learning comes from everything that's related to education, which starts at design, the delivery, the structure, everything that supports that structure. The physical space, all of that that's described in this diagram contributes towards inspired learning. Finally, feedback and dialogue. I'd go so far as to say that feedback and feedback as a dialogue is the essence of learning. Feedback is the essence of learning, and if we are effective in giving and receiving and responding to feedback, that could certainly be one of the ways in which we do ensure deep learning, meaningful learning, and learning that is useful for the future. Now, let me pause at this point and take a quick look at what the future is going to look like. I'd like you to have a look. Before I go there, let me show you the Scientia Education Academy. This is the academy that's been set up by the university to have a look at the future of education. We have a very wide vision here to look at how we might enhance the learning experience at UNSW. None of us are particularly proud of our pictures there, which is why you wouldn't see it on the website. We are working on a better picture. But those are the 15 inaugural fellows, and our mission is to look at ways in which we can make learning at UNSW better. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the Scientia Education Academy can contribute to the 4 pillars and contribute to the educational experience. I'd like to close the first part and open for questions by looking at this video. I'd like you to look at this wonderful video which gives us a glimpse into the future of UNSW.
Next stop, UNSW.
Right, let's take a small break at this point, because I'd really like to hear what you've got to say. Could I ask for any comments or questions from the audience before we move into part 2? As we start things off, can I start with a riddle? Any ideas? Sorry? A question, okay. Anyone else? Yeah? Okay.
Advice.
Advice, okay. Good. Yeah. No answer is wrong, so all answers are correct here. Any other guesses?
Education.
Yes. Yes. And feedback, yes, yeah.
I was going to say the DVCA, but perhaps because the DVCA is sitting here.
Yes, okay. No, that's good, that's good. Yeah, so feedback. So yes, as we can see, feedback is sometimes welcome, sometimes not, and it can discourage and it can encourage. So we have to be careful in how we use it, but if used well, it can certainly help perfect. So with that, yes, please, I welcome questions and comments.
I have to ask you, Chinthaka.
Yes.
Was it the same glass door?
Fortunately not. It was a different one. I don't know whether that makes it better or worse. Yeah, but it was a different one. And it was a newer one. It was perfectly shiny. It was invisible, yes. Yeah.
Hi, Chinthaka. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
I was curious about your comment about the digital community and the digital learning community and how important it now becomes to have a physical space in that. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Sure, sure. I'd love to, and welcome any other comments on that as well. What we see is a generation that has a social life which is becoming quite virtual. And we tend to extrapolate from that to imagine that they would simply embrace a similar environment if it was offered for the sake of learning. And I think that's an assumption that we really need to question. I would put that to the students in the room because it is a concern that many of us share. It's something that's written up about, that just because someone's good with a device or they are familiar with the online environment, it doesn't mean that that's their medium of choice for education. There is also that element of missing out and the fear of missing out. What do I miss out if my entire education is online? And that's a real concern that students have. And every time we speak to them about the online environment, it's a concern that comes up. What about the interaction? What about what I gain by interacting with the experts who are physically in a room? And of course, finally, the idea that university is not just a means to an end, but it is something that builds a community and a group that goes together with you for the rest of your life. And will the absence of a physical space impact on that? So these are some of the reasons for why a physical space becomes even more important as we move more and more of our activities online. So part of our solution here is to go for what's called blended. So we blend the online environment with the physical environment rather than go entirely online. So that is the middle path that we're trying to tread. And as we do that, my view is that the physical environment is more important. Did anyone have any other views on that? Yes? Gary, yes. Sorry.
Chinthaka, firstly, I sympathise. Walking into a glass door is a pain. We published last year a study about social media in medical education. It was a global study, and quite a consistent view of students around the world, medical students around the world, was that social media was their space. They didn't like teachers intruding into their space. So I think we need to be careful in that regard. Yeah. And I agree that there does need to be some modicum of teacher presence, whether it be online or particularly in a physical space, because in the end, interactions with intelligent humans is what makes the university experience.
Yeah. Thank you, Gary. Andrew, yeah, we can take one more question before we move on.
Yeah. So kind of just to reiterate on that, is that I recall in one course where the group work was all done online, and in having it online, it became very impersonal, and that loss of face-to-face connection with those people meant that I never met them, I never knew them, and yet we were expected to work together on a task. And because it was impersonal, I just never felt I formed a connection with those people in order to bring out the best, especially when compared to other group works where it was face-to-face, we met up, we got work done, and you really form that relationship, and it brings the work to another level where it really helps. I'm not quite sure how I'm trying to phrase this. It adds more to it than just an impersonal screen interacting with people.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. And I think that's a view shared by many, so thank you for sharing that with us. Right. Okay, so thank you for your questions and comments. Let's move on to part 2 now. This is where I try to tell you a bit of my story. I'll take you through some of the innovations that have happened at UNSW Medicine. We've got Gary and Phil here who've led many of these innovations. We'll talk to you about some of the PhD projects that have contributed towards our progress and get a quick glimpse into a few of those. Right, my personal journey. Not every one of you knows me, so I'll give you a quick snapshot of who I am. So, I started life in Sri Lanka. My earliest memories are of preschool in England, after which I spent much of my life in the beautiful island of Sri Lanka, where I was privileged to have an amazing education. And I had the privilege of going to some of the oldest and most traditional institutions, where I learned the value of tradition, but I also learned to question tradition and the need to move forward. I spent a very interesting year in Russia, and my roommate is here in this room with me today, and bonds really last forever. So thank you for making the time to come. And of course, the last 17 years I've been in Australia, and all of that at UNSW. I arrived at UNSW and virtually became part of the furniture. So I've been here for the last 17 years, and that says something about the UNSW community. The support, the connected nature that I have felt towards UNSW, and what the mutual relationship that I have had with the UNSW community. So, what's my approach towards educational innovation? That's what I like to do. I live and breathe education, and every day I look at problems, I look at my students, and I wonder what's going on with them. What are their struggles? What can I do to make their learning more effective? And when I see a problem, I try to get to the root of the problem. What's the root of the problem? And then I go to number 3, which is the most important point, which is to consult and collaborate. I speak to colleagues, I find out, are you facing the same problem? I speak to my students, what's going on? Why is there a barrier here? I try to clarify the problem. And then I come up with an idea, and then I trial it out in a very small scale. Very small scale, baby steps, start, trial, evaluate. And evaluate is the key word here. In everything we do, if we are to succeed, we need to have evaluation built in. Because not everything we do has to succeed, but we need to learn from everything we do. It's okay to fail as long as we learn and we know how to refine and move forward. So that has been the process that I have taken towards all of the innovations that I have developed. This is a quick graphic to talk about the innovation cycle. It's not a smooth path. There are obstacles ahead. But as long as we are mindful of what we are heading into, we can actually succeed in what we do. Now, to give a real-life example, I think this is what UNSW Medicine can be truly proud of. And I want to start by talking about collegiality and collaboration. At Medicine, the approach that we have taken has been a uniquely collaborative effort. When I arrived at UNSW in 2001, there was a large group of dedicated academics working on reforming the medical curriculum. And I was fortunate enough to become part of that. So everything that I'm going to talk about scenario-based learning are the results of what came from the efforts of a very large number of academics. And my role in this was extremely small, not insignificant, but very small. But to start with, what is scenario-based learning? It's something that we developed at UNSW in response to what we observed as the problems of problem-based learning. And the problem of problem-based learning was the problem. And so we removed the problem from problem-based learning. And if I may take a step back and expand on that, with problem-based learning, the idea was that you'd set a problem, you'd get students to solve that problem, and as a result of that process, they would take an amoeboid motion towards it and learn all of the content that surrounds that content area. But what subsequent research found was that when you set a problem, students take a straight line towards a solution, and they miss all of the content that surrounds that process. And so in scenario-based learning, one of the things we did was we removed the problem. And if it was a diagnosis, we gave it to them. There is no diagnostic dilemma here. The diagnosis is obvious. What we wanted students to focus on was the entire health scenario. What's going on with this person who's got a pain in his chest? What's going on with his family? What is causing this? What does risk mean? What sort of health system does this person live in? What sort of services do they have access to? And in what way can you as a practitioner do or not do things that will help or hinder their progress? So scenario-based learning is something that sets a holistic picture and helps students to get started from a very early stage. So we start this in year 1, and year 1 and 2 is where I do the bulk of my work. And it is, I can tell you, one of the most rewarding teaching experiences. And we don't even call it teaching, we call it facilitation of learning, because the process is within the students. So scenario-based learning was one of the key things that UNSW Medicine is really proud of. But as we look at all of what we do, we realize that each of those elements or each of those activities and approaches requires a certain set of skills if students are to succeed in. For example, in scenario-based learning, it's critical that students know what self-directed learning means. How do I go about being self-directed and teaching myself? What does peer teaching mean? What does collaboration mean? And how is collaboration different to collaborative learning? Just because I work well with others, does that make me an effective collaborative learner? What does critical thinking mean? How do I make decisions? How do I evaluate the quality of my decisions? How do I know that I'm on the right track? How do I deal with the multitude of information that's being thrown at me? So we take what we think of as an evidence-based approach to designing solutions to these problems. And collaboration has been at the heart of some of the innovations that we have developed. Collaboration at the level of collaborative learning through a PhD project that has just been concluded at UNSW Medicine. Collaboration as preparing our graduates to be better junior doctors. So some things, instruments that we can use at the level of graduation. And innovations that students can use along the way, including things like assessment for learning. And I'll elaborate a bit on that as we go forward. But collaboration is something that can build bridges. And I want to use this diagram to quickly give you a glimpse of what we have been doing in terms of the innovations that we have been developing. As you can see, if I can get the mouse, yes. We start at the bottom end where we have peer learning, then we've got interprofessional learning, workplace-based learning, and then teamwork as we enter the workforce. I need to acknowledge the work of one of my PhD students, Dr. Maha Iqbal, who's probably in the audience today, who's been doing a lot of valuable work around the area of collaboration. And she is responsible for developing this instrument that we call CLEDEX, which is an instrument that we use to promote collaborative learning competencies in our medical students. So that is starting at the lower end, when the students are junior. So we start from there and we move upwards. We've got a range of other activities which I won't go into in detail, but for example, we've got an assessment task that explicitly directs students towards taking the approaches that we require them to take in order to learn effectively in scenario-based learning. And that's published in Medit Portal. And then we reach the higher end, where as the students graduate, we've got an instrument called the TMEX. We must thank Gary for that name, where we have an instrument which prepares students as they graduate and enter medical practice. So the idea is that in order to be safe practitioners, there are a set of skills that are required for our graduates to transition from being a medical graduate to a junior doctor. And the TMEX aims to fill that void. The GET and the DET, these are two instruments that I'm particularly proud of. The GET stands for Guideline Enhancement Tool, and this is something that we developed in response to a need that was felt where clinicians were not adhering to clinical protocols and guidelines, and an instrument that arose from that, which is called the Decision Enhancement Tool, which is a more generic instrument that we can use to support decision-making in students. I'm conscious that we are running out of time, so I'll only touch very briefly on these two projects. And I touch on these two projects with great pride because this is an example of collaboration within collaboration. This is these are two instances where we have collaborated with our students, with our higher degree research students, on two PhD projects that were actually focused on collaboration. So the work of Dr. Maha Iqbal was at the junior end, and the work of Dr. Aselo Lupeliawa was at the senior end. And we've got some fantastic work that came out of that. The TMEX is now a world-renowned instrument. There's been a worldwide review done, and of the 4 instruments worldwide that were identified as suitable for teamwork in medicine, the TMEX is one of them. So this has a lot of traction globally, and it's now been translated and adapted to the Chinese medical education context as well. I think I spoke about these two, so I'm not going to spend any more time talking about the 2 instruments. I'll just mention that the Guideline Enhancement Tool, we have evaluated that within the GP training program using a grant from the National Heart Foundation. And the Decision Enhancement Tool is currently being developed for use with our medical students. OSPIA. Dr. Silas Taylor is in the room, and I'd like to really focus on the wonderful work that he has done. This is a fabulous piece of work. It is amazing in its simplicity. It has filled a gap in developing students' communication skills. As you know, developing consultation skills is a critical element of medical education, but allowing students sufficient opportunity to interact with real patients face-to-face has become a challenge, which has become more and more of a challenge over time. So the OSPIA that Silas, along with his team, has developed allows this to happen in the virtual environment, and this is a clear example of where the digital environment enriches what we do. It enriches it, it makes it more efficient, and it makes it equally effective, and in fact it adds value because it captures a range of information that the face-to-face interaction does not. I'll finish off by referring to a project that we are leading at UNSW Medicine through a Scientia education grant, and that's looking at formative peer review of teaching. Peer review of teaching is something that UNSW is embracing. It's going to happen both summatively and formatively. And as most of you would know, this involves teachers observing each other in order to give feedback and to make each other's practice better. The summative process is already in place, and what medicine has undertaken to do through this grant is to develop a process to formatively review each other's work so that there is no judgment, but there is more a developmental angle and a collegiality that we build into reviewing each other's work and providing feedback. So another initiative that we are developing in order to enhance the quality of education at UNSW. Right. So I'm going to start wrapping things up, and then I'll open for questions. But as I looked at the topic, I'm sure some of you who would have wondered, if all the world's a stage, where does the audience sit? And this is an important question, but the answer is obvious. We are both the players and the audience, and we all have a part to play. Which brings us to the next point. If all the world's a stage, are the actors ready? And is that the role of universities? Who are the actors? We've got the learners, we've got the educators, and we've got the global community. I'd like to ask you during the question and answer session about your views on what we need to do to get each of these groups ready. But to the learners, I say, be ready to embrace change. Change is coming, so adaptability and flexibility to embrace the change is going to be critically important. But as I say that, I'm not speaking to any particular group. I'm speaking to all of us, because all of us are learners. In this evolving world, all of us need to be ready to continuously learn, because the future is uncertain. To the educators, be flexible to interchange between those roles. We are learners one day, educators the other day, members of the global community the other day. We need to be flexible to move between those roles, but we need to be open to take feedback on board and adapt as feedback comes in from the community and from our learners. And to the global community and to all of you here, I extend a warm welcome to please join us in this quest, because the views of the community are critically important if we are to build a university and a higher education that is truly fit for the future. Bringing it all together, so I talked about a number of critically important elements, the capabilities we need to build the future-ready graduate. We need to think about collaboration, communication, reflection, self-directed learning, decision-making, and everything to be underpinned by ethical practice. What is our aim as a university? And I now speak directly to the students in the room. You come to us as diamonds. Everything that you need to succeed is within you. What we do is simply enable you to bring out the best in you, to find the path that suits you. So as we go forward, I encourage you to find your path and to become glittering diamonds that can really shine in this world. Thank you.
So we have some time for a few questions, so we open the floor now. We've got a couple of roving mics, so just put your hand up.
Chinthaka, thank you. That was a very insightful lecture, and thank you for a great presentation.
My question is that, so clearly the education in medical schools have gone through a transition over the last 10 years. And you're producing medical students that have learned medicine in a slightly different way to the clinicians that they would be interacting with when they actually get into hospitals and work with them. How are the students coping? How are they interacting with the clinicians who have had a more traditional teaching and education? And are you evaluating them at the back end of their internship to see how they're faring with this different form of teaching?
I think that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Randolph, for asking that question. This, I think, is a question that we grapple with a lot. Phil and Gary are here, and they know that it's something that we are extremely conscious of. And to expand on the question that was just asked, the question is that we place a high reliance on clinical teachers to educate our medical students. And as they go out there, the clinicians that supervise the training of our students are actually familiar with a quite different style of learning and teaching. So there is a gap there that needs to be filled. The answer to your question lies in two initiatives that we have underway. One is more dialogue with the clinicians. And what we've developed at UNSW Medicine is something which we call BLAST. And BLAST stands for Blended Learning Approaches to Supervisor Training. So we understand that supervisors are time poor. And it's not possible for us to necessarily ask supervisors to come in and engage in this dialogue with us. So we are in the process of developing a suite of blended learning modules that supervisors can look at and understand the context from which the students are coming to them. So we've started rolling that out to general practice. It hasn't reached surgery yet, but that's the path that we are on, where the modules would give the clinical trainers an overview of what our program is like and some level of insight into the structure of our program. I do understand, though, that that is only one small step in a long road towards bridging that gap. Thank you for that question.
Hello, Leonie Lidgetwood here. I'm interested in your ideas about student support, and especially given the large student population we have and moving online. How do you see that being developed at scale?
The how, yes. The how is a really good question. And I think what's really important for it to succeed are the principles that underlie the how. So we need to really build the online experience on principles that are sound. We know what the theory tells us, and that is where we would start. But evaluation is a critical element. So start small, evaluate, learn from our experience, hear what our students say, and then go large scale. That would be the approach that I would be advocating for, but there may be other views in the room.
Can I ask you a question following on from Randolph's question? So you very carefully said you look at a global perspective, you look out at various things, and you also examine and reflect on your own conduct and constantly doing experiments. Do our graduates have anything that is distinctive? So when they're interns in a hospital, when I look at the sector, I don't know a lot about it, but I know Newcastle was very innovative back perhaps in the late 1990s. Sydney University brought in graduate problem-based learning. We have our own system, which you've reformed together with Phil and Gary and others. You know, but the proof of the pudding's in the tasting. And, if you go out to a hospital or your own experiences, can you tell where a student was taught? Is it having a difference? And can we learn from others over there? Some people do better than us.
Yes. Tony has just walked in as well, and Tony would be also able to add to this. What we have found is that the differences disappear very fast. So while there could be a difference at the point of graduation, that disappears very fast as students start practicing in the workplace. So that is number one. But number two, to answer your question about is anything unique to Australia, not necessarily unique, but important is the fact that we do have a number of models currently in play. So there's a number of models which are used by a range of medical schools, which means that a clinical supervisor who is receiving a student doesn't have a clear understanding of which model this person may be coming from. And that is probably the question that Randolph was referring to as he was asking about the difficulties of bridging that gap between the clinical supervisors and our graduates. Tony, I'm not sure whether you had anything more to add to that. Yeah.
Well, I apologise for coming late. I've been with patients. I'm not sure whether other people like Phil or Gary have also spoken about it. But certainly in my experience, and this is not necessarily research-based, but speaking to colleagues and working with junior doctors from all different universities, certainly here in Sydney and New South Wales and interstate, there's no doubt that the way we teach medical students is different. So, for example, Wollongong University has a lot more attachments to primary care, so that those students there have had a lot more exposure to the general practice, public health issues and stuff like that. At UNSW, we have the Independent Learning Project, which is a whole year of in-depth research. So I think our students are actually better equipped when it comes to individual research. But I think Chintaka's right. After a few years, those things disappear. With their workplace training. And also the variation we see is within the individuals. You might have a graduate from Wollongong who's very interested in research, and they may be doing research as a postgraduate, and they will then shine as a research graduate. And then you might have someone from UNSW who's really interested in primary care. So that the variation, I think, is more within the medical schools than from the medical schools. Again, I'm not sure whether Phil or Gary wants to add to that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Yes, I do.
Chinthaka. Michael here. Thanks for the great lecture, Chinthaka, and I wanted to ask a question about student support as well.
Sure.
And reflecting when I was a student, it wasn't, in a certain sense, difficult from a financial perspective. The policies were different then. University was practically full-time work. But when I see students now, particularly students on placement and the students I supervise, it would be the unusual student who does not have a fairly significant life outside of the university sector, either in care duties or in terms of finances for themselves. And obviously, I think the international medical students, they have significant financial stresses as well. This, I don't think, is going to be something that's going to change moving into the medium term. And how do we as a university support students in that context?
Yeah. Michael, I think that is a really important question. Not one that I will claim to have an answer to, but I can start by simply validating what you've just said. The diversity amongst our student group is quite amazing. And the way they carry that weight is even more amazing. If we take the trouble to speak to individual students, we start to understand the weight they carry, the balances they have to make, how they balance work and life, and how sometimes our processes are not flexible enough to accommodate that. And while the experience at medicine is very positive, and the student experience is very positive. Medicine is probably one of those places where the structure is quite rigid, and allowing for flexibility is not easy within that structure. I know that the rest of the university is looking at more flexible ways, and we are looking at designing and the design and delivery of programs to enable students to take a more modular approach. And I know the work that we're doing with Marina is looking at that to allow students to structure and tailor their programs so that they can actually fit with what other things they have going on in their life. But it is a particular challenge that we have for medicine, and I don't think we've solved that one yet.
One more question.
Well, Chinthaka, thank you very much for the very inspiring and very knowledgeable talk.
Thank you.
I know we were together in Russia and we were medical students there. So I'm the one who was with him in the same room, sharing the same room. So one of the things about, I think coming from Randall's question as well, about how to sort of bridge the gap between a medical student, how he actually learns, and perhaps how the consultants who are teaching them has learned. There's a big gap. But there is also a big gap between how students accumulate knowledge and gain knowledge, and how actually they use that knowledge in the practical scenario. So obviously, most of the things that you mentioned about the innovative ways of learning can be sort of happening in the universities so that they can acquire knowledge in various different ways. But I'm just wondering whether the students are prepared to see how they can use the knowledge in a practical way, whether that gap is actually fulfilled in the universities.
Yeah. Thank you, Sajiv, for that question. Great question. I'll start broad, and I think one of the, so looking at our university as a whole, work readiness and preparedness for work is a big factor, and it's one of the big initiatives that the university is looking at for all our graduates. For medicine in particular, we do realize that there is a gap, and this gap is worldwide. In the UK, it was called the killing season, the time at which new graduates start work as interns. In the US, it was called something else, but the phenomenon was similar. Causation was not established. It was only an observation that this happened around the time that new graduates started work as interns. So the gap is real. What we have in place at UNSW Medicine is what's called the PRINT. So PRINT stands for Preparation for Internship. It's the 6-week period between the point at which students finish all their assessments. As you know, while you're preparing for assessments, assessments are the top priority in your head. And everything you do is focused towards assessment. What we do is we allow them to go through all of that, finish everything. Once they've got past their final assessment, we have a 6-week period during which they can actually go into a real ward, engage with real clinicians, see what a real hospital works like, so that they get an insight into a real internship before they actually start work as an intern. So that's one small step that we've taken. But again, I do understand that there's probably more that we can do. Thank you. I think it's probably time to wrap up. So
thank you very much for the presentation and for answering all those questions. It's also time for us to acknowledge, first of all, Chinthaka, thank you very much for being a member of the Academy. We acknowledge that you are a dedicated educator, and we thank you for dedicating your career to medical education and to your students, and you obviously care very passionately about your students, so we thank you for that. Also, if all the world is a stage, then I think you have shown us quite well tonight how one can walk upon that stage in a collegial and collaborative way. So thank you very much. That's all, thank you.